It's just a family getaway, Grandma. You wouldn't enjoy it, they said. Then I saw the pictures from the resort I owned. It began, as these things often do, with a lie wrapped in the language of love. I was sitting in my son Robert's impossibly white kitchen, the kind of kitchen that looks like it's never seen a single splash of spaghetti sauce. He and his wife Susan were telling me about their plans for a grand family getaway in the summer. Their faces were bright with excitement. And when I smiled, my own heart filling with a familiar, hopeful warmth, Susan reached over and patted my hand. "Oh, Grandma," she said, her voice full of a sweet, practiced concern. "It's just a family getaway. It's very rustic and active, you know. All the walking, the heat. You wouldn't enjoy it. It's better if you just relax at home. You wouldn't enjoy it." The phrase was so familiar, a ghost of 1,000 other small dismissals I had endured over the years. I remembered them saying the same thing about my granddaughter's rock concert, about the modern art exhibit they claimed was too strange for me. For years, I had nodded and smiled, telling myself they were just being thoughtful, that they knew me best. I had endured because I loved them, and I thought that was the price of peace. But this time, sitting in their cold white kitchen, the dismissal felt different, sharper. It was not just a concert or a museum. It was a family vacation, and I was not being invited. I said nothing, of course. I just smiled my polite grandmotherly smile and told them it sounded wonderful and that they should have a marvelous time. They were so relieved by my easy acceptance. They saw a simple, frail old woman content with her quiet life. They have no idea who I really am. They see my small, paid-off house and my faded cardigans, and they assume they are looking at the whole picture. They never once thought to ask about the chapters they couldn't see, the ones where my late husband George, a man they remember as a quiet, unassuming contractor, was in fact a brilliant and discreet property investor. The ones where he left me not just memories, but a portfolio. It's a strange feeling to be so deeply known and yet so completely misunderstood by your own family, isn't it? As I share this story, I find myself wondering where you are in the world listening to this. It would bring me such comfort to know where my words have found a home. If you have a moment, please leave a comment to let me know where you're from, and consider subscribing to Granny Stories to hear what happened next. My son Robert, he was the master of not seeing. It had become a habit. I remembered my 75th birthday. I had wanted a simple party in my own backyard with my old friends and a homemade cake. Instead, they threw me a surprise party at their house. They invited their friends, served food they liked, and played music that gave me a headache. I spent most of the evening in the kitchen, refilling plates, feeling like a guest of honor at an event that had absolutely nothing to do with me. I had smiled through the whole thing, enduring it because their happiness, I told myself, was more important than my own. I drove home from their perfect, polished house that day, the echo of their concern for my well-being ringing hollow in my ears. For years, I had accepted these small erasures, these gentle dismissals, telling myself it was the price of keeping the family together. I had endured it all out of love. But as I pulled into my own quiet driveway, I looked at the home I had built, the life I had lived, and I realized something new. Enduring is not the same as living, and I was suddenly profoundly tired of just enduring. The weeks following that conversation were filled with a new kind of silence. The phone calls from my son Robert became less frequent, and when he did call, his voice was strained with a forced cheerfulness that did not reach his eyes. He would ask about my garden, about the weather, never mentioning the trip again as if it were a closed subject, a door quietly shut between us. I did not push it. I had learned long ago that pushing my son only made him retreat further into the cool, polished world his wife Susan had built for him. So, I spent my days in my own quiet rhythm, tending to my roses, rereading old novels, and trying to ignore the dull, persistent ache in my chest. I told myself it was for the best. I told myself I would have been a burden. I told myself the lies they wanted me to believe. The truth arrived on a Tuesday, as it often does in a plain manila envelope. It was my quarterly report from the wealth management firm that has handled my husband's estate since he passed. It is a ritual I perform 4 times a year, a duty to George's memory. I sit at his old oak desk, put on my reading glasses, and review the numbers just as he taught me. I see it not as a collection of assets, but as the final tangible proof of a life of hard work and quiet wisdom. I poured myself a cup of tea and began to read through the pages. The stock portfolio was steady. The municipal bonds were performing as expected. It was all very routine, very predictable. Then I turned to the last page, the one detailing the performance of the private real estate holdings. I scanned the list of familiar names, a small office building in Charleston, a warehouse near the port, and then my eyes stopped. One line of text seemed to lift off the page, suddenly sharp and 3-dimensional. Osprey Cove Resort SC Performance, 8% year-to-date. Osprey Cove, the name of the rustic and active place my son had so carefully protected me from. The place I was too old, too frail, too simple to enjoy. The place I owned. I felt the teacup rattle in its saucer. I had to set it down before I dropped it. I read the line again and again. There was no mistake. It was one of George's passion projects, a small, struggling coastal property he had bought years ago and slowly transformed into a quiet, elegant sanctuary. I managed it from a distance through a trusted firm, but I knew every detail of its balance sheet. I knew the cost of its linens, the profit margin on its restaurant, the salaries of its staff, the full weight of their condescension, of their casual, cruel dismissal, hit me with the force of a physical blow. They had deemed me unfit to visit a place whose success paid for the very pension they assumed was my only means of survival. They had looked at the matriarch of their family, the secret architect of their own financial security, and had seen nothing but a fragile old woman who needed to be managed, protected, and ultimately sidelined. The pain was sharp and absolute. But then something else rose up through the pain. A cold, clear, and utterly unfamiliar rage. I looked at the photograph of George on my desk, his kind, smiling eyes. He had left me his wealth, not so I could hide in the shadows of my children's lives, but so I could be free. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. They thought they knew who I was. They had created a small, convenient, and entirely fictional character for me to play in their lives. I sat there in the quiet of my little house, the financial report spread before me like a declaration of war, and I decided it was time they met the woman whose name was on the deed. It was time they met the owner. The rage I felt that afternoon did not burn hot and fast. It cooled into something far more useful. It cooled into a plan. I spent that evening at my husband's old desk, the place where he had quietly built the very fortune my son now took for granted. I did not look at photo albums or sentimental keepsakes. I looked at spreadsheets, at profit and loss statements, at the blueprints for the life I had forgotten I owned. The grief was still there, a deep, sorrowful chord, but now a new, sharper melody was playing over it. The melody of a woman who had just remembered her own name. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Mr. Sterling, my wealth manager, a man whose voice always carried a tone of respectful deference that my own son had long since abandoned. I did not ask about my pension. I asked for a detailed operational report on Osprey Cove Resort. I asked about the head manager, about the VIP protocols, about the owner's villa that had sat empty for the 5 years since George's passing. I was no longer a passive client receiving a report. I was an owner gathering intelligence. The second call was to the resort itself. A man with a smooth, professional voice answered. "Mr. Davies, please." "Margaret Thompson calling." There was a pause, and then the manager's voice came on the line, colored with a slight nervous confusion. I introduced myself simply. "Mr. Davies, my name is Margaret Thompson. I believe my late husband George entrusted you with the management of Osprey Cove." The silence on his end was profound. I had been a name on a legal document to him for years, a ghost owner. Now I was a voice on his telephone. I laid out my instructions with a calm precision that would have surprised my own children. I informed him that I would be arriving for an unscheduled inspection the day before the Thompson party in rooms 305 and 307 was due to check in. I would be staying in the owner's villa, and under no circumstances was my identity to be revealed to any of the guests, especially not to the Thompson party. To the staff, I was to be referred to only as Ms. Thompson. To the world, I was to be a wealthy, anonymous guest. I told him he was to grant my family every standard courtesy, but to report any issues or complaints directly and discreetly to me. "Am I understood, Mr. Davies?" I asked. "Perfectly, Ms. Thompson." He replied, his voice now stripped of all confusion and full of a new, sharp focus. I did not cancel their reservation. That would have been an act of anger, a simple, satisfying slam of a door. My plan was not about anger. It was about clarity. It was about education. They had built a story about me, a story of a frail, simple-minded woman who should be kept at home for her own good. I had decided it was time to introduce them to a different character. I packed a single suitcase. I did not pack the faded cardigans and sensible shoes they were used to seeing. I packed the cream linen trousers I hadn't worn in a decade. I packed the silk blouse that felt like water against the skin. I packed my mother's pearl earrings. I was not packing for a vacation. I was packing for a performance. My husband had always loved a well-executed plan. And this one, I thought, as I closed the suitcase, was going to be a masterpiece. My arrival at Osprey Cove was not that of a grandmother coming for a quiet holiday. It was the arrival of a queen returning to her forgotten kingdom. A private car arranged by the ever-efficient Mr. Davies met me at the airport. The driver did not call me ma'am, he called me Ms. Thompson. As we drove through the resort's magnificent wrought iron gates, flanked by ancient moss-draped oak trees, I felt a sense of belonging so profound it was almost a physical ache. This was mine. The scent of salt and gardenias in the air, the quiet, understated elegance of the main lodge, it was all a testament to my husband's vision and to my quiet stewardship. Mr. Davies was waiting for me. He escorted me personally not to a room, but to the owner's villa, a secluded bungalow set high on a bluff with an unobstructed view of the Atlantic. The villa was a world I had only ever seen on financial reports. It had its own small infinity pool that seemed to spill directly into the ocean, a terrace large enough for a party of 50. And inside the rooms were filled with fresh orchids and the quiet hum of perfect, silent air conditioning. It was a place of breathtaking luxury, the very place my family had deemed I wouldn't enjoy. I spent that first day acclimatizing to my own power. I walked the private beach below my villa. I had a solitary, perfect lunch of grilled fish and chilled white wine brought to my terrace. I did not feel lonely. I felt sovereign. This wasn't a vacation. It was a reclamation. I was remembering the woman I was before I became the quiet, accommodating woman they expected me to be. The next afternoon, from the shade of my terrace, I watched them arrive. They tumbled out of an airport shuttle, a chaotic jumble of luggage complaints about the heat and teenage size. Robert was already on his phone, his face creased with the stress of his important world. Susan was trying to direct the bellhop, her voice a little too loud, a little too eager to perform her status as a guest at a fine resort. They looked so small from up here. My small, noisy, oblivious family, completely unaware that the queen was already in her castle watching them from the highest tower. I watched them check in. I watched them argue over who would carry which bag. I watched them disappear into the main building, into the standard garden view rooms I knew they had booked. And I felt a complex and painful cocktail of emotions, a deep residual love for the family they once were, a profound sadness for the strangers they had become, and a cold, steady confirmation that I was doing the right thing. As the sun began to set, casting a golden, forgiving light over the entire resort, I picked up the private telephone line that connected directly to the manager's office. "Mr. Davies," I said, my voice calm and clear. "The Thompson party in rooms 325 and 307. I believe they will be dining at your seaside restaurant this evening. Please send a complimentary bottle of the 98 Dom Perignon to their table." There was a pause on his end. "Of course, Ms. Thompson," he said. "And the card, what should it say?" I smiled, looking out over my ocean, my resort, my new and terrible stage. The card, I said, should read simply, "From the owner. Welcome to my home." I hung up the phone. The game I thought had officially begun. The report from Mr. Davies came via a discreet phone call the next morning. The champagne, he informed me, had been a resounding success. At first, there was delight, then profound confusion. My son Robert had apparently questioned the waiter extensively about the identity of the owner. The staff, following my precise instructions, had been politely evasive, only adding to the mystery. Mr. Davies told me they spent the rest of their dinner speaking in hushed tones, occasionally glancing around the restaurant as if expecting a mysterious benefactor to appear. Their romantic dinner had been transformed into an exercise in paranoia. I thanked him and hung up a small, cold smile on my face. That day, I decided to observe my little experiment up close. I had Mr. Davies reserve the most private cabana at the adults-only pool, the one right next to the standard cabana I knew my family would be using. I arrived early, settling in behind a pair of large, dark sunglasses, a wide-brimmed hat, and a thick novel. I was in plain sight, but utterly invisible. They arrived an hour later, a flurry of towels and sunscreen, And as they settled in, I listened. Susan was giddy with the mystery. She was convinced they were being scouted, that some important tycoon who knew of Robert's work was at the resort and was testing them, courting them. Robert, however, was suspicious. I heard him tell her it felt strange, that it made him uneasy. They were having two entirely different vacations right next to each other. One was a fantasy of being chosen, the other, a paranoid fear of being watched. Neither of them was present in the simple reality of a sunny day by a beautiful pool. It's a funny thing to be the subject of a mystery you created yourself. Have you ever sat in a room completely unseen, while people talked about you as if you were a ghost? That afternoon, I made my next move. I called Mr. Davies again. The Thompson party. I said I believe there has been a plumbing issue in their block of rooms. Please upgrade them to the oceanfront junior suite on the 5th floor for the inconvenience. With my compliments. I watched from my terrace as a bellhop arrived at their cabana to deliver the news. I saw Susan's look of absolute triumph and Robert's deeper, more troubled confusion. Their perfect vacation was getting better and better, and it was slowly driving my son mad. From the quiet of my villa that evening, I watched them in their beautiful new suite with its magnificent private balcony. They had everything they could have wanted: a free upgrade, a luxury vacation, a story to tell their friends back home. But they weren't enjoying it. They were pacing. I could see their tense silhouettes against the warm light of their room, their gestures sharp and agitated. Their perfect getaway had been poisoned by a single terrifying question: who is doing this and what do they want? They were so busy looking for the powerful man they imagined was pulling the strings. They never once thought to look for the old, frail woman they had decided would only slow them down. And that, I thought, as I sipped my tea in the cool evening air, was the most delicious irony of all. On their final full day at the resort, I decided it was time for the curtain to rise on my little play. I spent the morning in quiet preparation. I did not go to the pool or the beach. I stayed in my villa, a general planning her final decisive battle. I instructed Mr. Davies to arrange a small, elegant cocktail reception on my terrace for sunset. Just for a few special guests, I told him. He understood immediately. By late afternoon, my private terrace had been transformed. There was a small bar with champagne chilling on ice, and platters of exquisite appetizers were arranged on tables draped in white linen. Soft music played from invisible speakers. It was a perfect picture of effortless luxury. I took my time getting ready. I chose a simple, elegant silk dress in a deep ocean blue. I wore my real pearls, the ones George had given me for our 40th anniversary, not the costume jewelry my daughter was used to seeing. I looked at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back was not the frail, simple grandmother they had left at home. She was someone else. She was the owner. At 6 o'clock, a crisp, embossed invitation was delivered to my family suite. I had written the words myself. The owner of Osprey Cove Resort requests the pleasure of your company for sunset cocktails at the owner's villa. It was a lure they could not possibly resist, an invitation directly into the heart of the mystery that had consumed their vacation. I was standing on the terrace, my back to the door, looking out at the sun as it began its slow, fiery descent into the sea. I heard the soft click of the door opening. I heard their footsteps on the stone tiles, their hushed, expectant whispers. I did not turn around. Not yet. I let them take in the scene. I let them see the champagne, the orchids, the private infinity pool. I let them build the image in their minds of the powerful, mysterious tycoon they were about to meet. Then, when the silence was stretched to its breaking point, I turned. Slowly. I held my glass of champagne, and I smiled a small, cool, polite smile. I will never, for as long as I live, forget the looks on their faces. It was not just shock. It was a complete and utter system failure. The carefully constructed world of their vacation, their status, their very understanding of their own family crumbled to dust in that single silent moment. Susan's face went white, her mouth opening slightly, but no sound coming out. Robert simply froze his hand still on the door, his face a mask of pure, horrified disbelief. I let them stand there for a long moment, marinating in the beautiful, terrible irony of it all. Then I raised my glass. Robert. Susan, I said, and my voice was as calm and smooth as the sea before me. I'm so glad you could make it. I was so worried this sort of thing would be too much for you that you wouldn't enjoy it. But you all seem to be managing just fine. They stood there on my terrace, surrounded by the luxury they craved and the truth they had tried so hard to escape. They had no words. What could they possibly say they had arrived as the special guests of a mysterious, powerful man, and they had found only their mother? The frail old woman they had left behind. The woman who, as it turned out, owned the entire world they had been so desperate to be a part of. The sun had set. The party was over. And the bill I thought was finally coming due. The cocktail party for 3 lasted only 20 minutes. There was no shouting, no grand confrontation. There was no need. My victory was silent, absolute, and reflected in the stunned, pale faces of my son and his wife. I acted as the gracious host, offering them champagne they did not drink and appetizers they did not touch. Robert tried to stammer an apology, a pathetic string of words about misunderstandings and good intentions. I held up a hand, not out of anger, but simply to stop the noise. I told them that the arrangement where I was the invisible silent benefactor was over. I told them that from now on, our relationship, if it was to continue, would be built on a foundation of honesty. They would not lie to me about who I am or what I am capable of ever again. And they would teach their children that their grandmother was not a fragile relic to be sheltered, but the woman whose hard work and quiet wisdom had built the very paradise they were standing in. They left my villa in silence. The next morning from my terrace, I watched them check out of the resort a day early. I did not return home right away. The act of coming here, of stepping into the role I had long neglected, had awakened something in me. I decided to stay. I spent the next few months at Osprey Cove, not as a guest, but as the owner. I walked the grounds every morning. I learned the names of the staff. I sat in on management meetings, and I learned the business not from spreadsheets, but from the people who made it run. I discovered I was good at it. My son tried to turn my story into a quiet ending, but it turns out it was just the prologue. My life since that day has become one of the most unexpected grandma true stories I could have imagined. I've learned that the best grandma true stories aren't always about baking cookies for your family. Sometimes they're about quietly owning the resort they didn't think you could handle. It's a truth that I see in the tales shared on Granny Stories all the time. We are so much more than the small, convenient roles our families sometimes assign to us. They thought my world was small, but my world was always vast. They just weren't looking at the right map. The most powerful grandma true stories are not about fading away. They are about remembering the power we have held quietly all along and finally choosing to use it for ourselves. Thank you for being with me on this unexpected journey. If my story has reminded you of a hidden strength or a secret chapter in your own life, I would be so honored if you would share your thoughts or a piece of your own story in the comments below. The wisdom we find in each other's hidden histories is the greatest treasure of all. If you know someone who needs a reminder that they are the owner of their own life, please feel free to share this story. And to hear more tales of quiet power, please consider subscribing to Granny Stories. Thank you for listening from my home to yours.